The foundation is completely compromised.
This is unbelievable. Everyone stay back! It's not stable!
Stop this demolition! I'm the governor!
Ma'am, the HOA has authority here. You've ignored the fines for months.
Too bad!
Peaceful beginnings. Alex Mercer's mornings began like clockwork, in the quiet solitude of their sprawling mountain estate. Perched atop a cliff overlooking the valley, the mansion was a testament to years of hard work, ambition, and a life meticulously curated. The sunlight spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating polished oak floors and walls adorned with rare art. Outside, the garden stretched in geometrical perfection, fountains burbling softly as birds flitted between sculpted shrubs. The scent of pine mixed with roses carried on the cool mountain breeze, painting a picture of serenity that seemed almost unreal. For Alex, life was both privilege and sanctuary. The mansion's design was deliberate. Airy galleries for private reflection, expansive terraces for entertaining, and a library that housed both political manuscripts and first-edition novels. It was here, amid the grandeur and the stillness, that Alex found the balance between public life as governor and private life as a human being seeking peace. Despite the estate's splendor, Mountain Ridge Estates, the gated community surrounding the mansion, had its own subtle pressures. The neighborhood, a collection of opulent homes and landscaped streets, was predominantly homogeneous. Families had lived there for generations, and the social hierarchies were both rigid and quietly enforced. Alex, a multiracial individual who had recently risen to the position of state governor, was both celebrated for their achievements and subtly marked as an outsider. The smiles were polite, but sometimes it felt as though everyone was calculating, measuring Alex against invisible standards they could never fully meet. Neighbors like Caroline Voss, with her manicured hedges and perfectly aligned flower beds, and Richard Hale, the HOA president who carried himself with a meticulous air of authority, exemplified the social codes of the enclave. They greeted Alex warmly enough, but there was always a faint edge to their words, a weight beneath the civility. Small things like Caroline's pointed compliment about Alex's interesting choice of garden sculptures, or Hale's casual inquiry into whether state officials should have so much influence here, hinted at the underlying tension. Alex often dismissed these moments as minor quirks of human nature, but the unease lingered, a subtle hum beneath the otherwise calm routine. Perhaps it was the sense that, despite wealth and political power, some boundaries were still deeply ingrained in the community, coded and enforced by social expectation rather than law. The first sign of real disturbance came quietly, in the form of an unassuming letter slipped under the mansion's front door. Its envelope was official-looking but small, almost easy to ignore. Inside, the HOA listed minor infractions: an allegedly overgrown flower bed, a vehicle parked slightly outside designated lines, and a complaint from a neighbor about outdoor lighting. The language was polite but firm, a bureaucratic tone that suggested consequences if ignored. Alex set the letter aside, a small frown forming, but ultimately convinced it was more formality than threat. As days passed, the letters became a subtle presence in the mansion, like shadows stretching across polished floors in the late afternoon. They were small irritations at first, $50 fines here, $75 fines there, but something in the tone began to shift. They were no longer simply reminders, they were warnings. A gentle foreshadowing that the idyllic life atop the mountain might not be as untouchable as it seemed. Alex's staff, loyal and attentive, noticed the letters too. Maya Chun, Alex's legal advisor, mentioned casually during a morning briefing that HOAs sometimes escalate matters to assert authority, especially in communities with entrenched traditions. Alex laughed lightly, brushing it off. They were the governor, after all, surely a few HOA fines could not touch them. Yet, even as they returned to their morning ritual of coffee on the terrace, the subtle anxiety lingered, a quiet tension beneath the serenity. The community itself seemed oblivious, or perhaps complicit, in this slow assertion of control. Children rode bicycles along the winding streets, their laughter echoing off the stone facades of neighboring mansions. Landscape lawns gleamed under the sun, every detail a testament to social expectation and meticulous order. Yet behind the beauty, Alex noticed patterns. Service staff who spoke differently to neighbors than to them, subtle glances when Alex's mixed-race heritage came up in casual conversation, a quiet hierarchy that dictated who was inside and who remained slightly outside. These details were easy to overlook, Yet they made Alex aware that the mountain paradise was not as neutral as it seemed. By the end of the first week, Alex's life remained outwardly perfect. Walks through the estate, meetings with staff, time in the library and art galleries, and evenings on the veranda with friends. But beneath the polished exterior, there was a growing awareness that the HOA's small disturbances, these letters, fines, and subtle insinuations, were the first ripples of a larger, more insidious wave. In Mountain Ridge estates, the beauty and calm could be a mask, hiding undercurrents of power, prejudice, and control that even a governor might struggle to counter. Small disturbances and uneasy ripples. By the second week, what had seemed like a minor inconvenience, the HOA letters, had begun to gnaw at Alex Mercer's otherwise orderly routine. Each envelope, crisp and stamped with the official Mountain Ridge Estates logo, carried increasingly specific grievances. The first few fines had been trivial: a hedge deemed slightly overgrown, a vehicle parked a foot beyond the painted line. Now the language had shifted. The HOA noted non-compliance with community standards and failure to adhere to bylaws. As if the once polite neighborhood bureaucracy had grown teeth, Alex, ever confident in their position as governor, initially regarded the letters as bureaucratic overreach. "It's the usual small-town pettiness," Alex remarked to Maya-chan, their legal advisor, during a morning briefing in the sunlit library. Maya, poised and meticulous, frowned. "Small-town pettiness can escalate quickly when unchecked, especially here," she cautioned. "HOAs in communities like Mountain Ridge have legal tools, and sometimes they wield them aggressively." Alex chuckled, dismissing it. After all, how much influence could a homeowners association exert over a sitting governor? Yet the tension was undeniable. Alex began noticing the way neighbors looked at the mansion, not with curiosity or admiration, but with subtle judgment. Caroline Voss, whose gardens were immaculate enough to win awards, remarked casually one afternoon, "Interesting choice of sculpture placement, Alex. Not everyone appreciates bold statements." Her smile was polite, but her eyes hinted at criticism. Alex noted the double meaning immediately. In Mountain Ridge, even artistic expression was a test of conformity. The social dynamics of the community were delicate. While Mountain Ridge Estates was affluent and outwardly polite, the unspoken hierarchy was clear. Long-standing families subtly controlled local norms. Newcomers, even someone of Alex's stature, were often viewed as outsiders until they conformed. Service staff treated neighbors with casual warmth but responded to Alex with heightened formality, careful not to overstep. Whispered comments occasionally drifted across the manicured lawns during morning walks. Remarks about politics, about race, about privilege, all carrying an undercurrent of exclusion. As the days passed, the HOA letters began to feel less like reminders and more like warnings. The fines grew larger, compounded by late fees, and the tone of the correspondence became sharper. Alex received a notice suggesting that persistent non-compliance could result in legal action, and the phrasing, carefully neutral but unmistakably ominous, hinted at potential escalation beyond mere financial penalties. For the first time, Alex felt a flicker of unease. One afternoon, while walking along the terrace overlooking the valley, Alex reflected on the irony. The mountain that had once symbolized peace and isolation now seemed to magnify every imperfection, every deviation from the community's unwritten rules. Birds chirped cheerfully, fountains gurgled in harmony, but in the distance, the perfectly trimmed hedges of neighbors and the stone facades of their homes seemed almost accusatory, each one silently signaling who belonged and who remained subtly outside. Small incidents began to accumulate. A gardener mentioned that neighbors had called, questioning why a newly installed guest pavilion didn't match the aesthetic of the estate. The landscape designer whispered nervously that the HOA had already flagged the structure for review. A security guard, normally confident and casual, hesitated before reporting a minor complaint from a neighbor about late-night lighting. Even minor deviations, choices in decor, garden design, or security protocol, were now scrutinized, highlighting how tightly social conformity was enforced. Alex, conscious of their public role and private wealth, still underestimated the power of the HOA. The sense of control they had enjoyed, the freedom to curate life atop the mountain, was subtly eroding. The once idyllic valley, which had felt like a sanctuary, now carried an undertone of vigilance, as if every hedge, every stone pathway, and every neighborly glance were part of a quiet surveillance system. Yet life outwardly continued with its polished routine. Afternoons were spent in the library, reviewing state policy, while evenings were devoted to private dinners on the terrace or late-night walks among the flower beds. Friends visiting the mansion remarked on the tranquility, the panoramic views, and the sense of calm that seemed untouchable. But Alex could feel the tension lurking beneath, like the faint rumble of a distant storm, subtle but persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. The seeds of unease were firmly planted. What began as trivial HOA complaints now hinted at a larger, more insidious force, a combination of bureaucratic authority, social hierarchy, and unspoken prejudice. Alex understood intellectually that their political influence could intervene at almost any point. But the mountain, the estate, and the community around it carried rules that wealth alone could not rewrite. The small disturbances were the first ripples of a wave, one that threatened to disrupt the life Alex had so carefully built. By the end of the section, the serene life atop the mountain was under quiet siege. The letters, the whispers, the subtle social judgments, all hinted at an approaching conflict. Alex's initial confidence remained, but the first hints of vulnerability had arrived, setting the stage for escalation. The community's beauty and calm had become a mask, hiding a network of social control, bureaucratic authority, and racial dynamics that would challenge even the most powerful resident. Escalation and unseen threats. The morning sun cast long shadows across Alex Mercer's estate, illuminating the grand terrace and glistening fountains that had once symbolized peace and control. Yet beneath the surface, the sense of serenity that had defined Alex's mountain life was beginning to fray. The HOA letters, once a minor nuisance, had grown insistent and menacing. Each one carried higher fines, references to continued non-compliance, and veiled threats of legal action. Alex, accustomed to influence and authority, initially thought the situation laughable. They had faced political challenges far greater than a homeowners association. But the persistence of the notices, coupled with the subtle hostility embedded in the tone, began to chip away at that confidence. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. The HOA intended to assert control, regardless of Alex's status as governor. Neighbors who had once greeted Alex with polite smiles now seemed distant. Caroline Voss's compliments on the gardens had evolved into faintly critical remarks about excessive extravagance, and Richard Hale, the HOA president, began requesting frequent compliance reviews of the property. The subtext was unmistakable. Alex's presence, wealth, and identity were tolerated, but not beyond the boundaries the community had quietly enforced. Social dynamics in Mountain Ridge estates were layered and precise. While outward appearances suggested harmony, the undercurrents of race and social hierarchy shaped interactions in subtle ways. Staff spoke differently to Alex than to other residents, formal, careful, deferential, as though navigating an invisible set of rules. Children of long-standing families greeted Alex with polite curiosity but avoided deeper interaction, reflecting the unspoken message that newcomers, or those who did not fully fit the established mold, were always other. The tension escalated one evening when a neighbor called the security team to report unauthorized activity in the garden. Alex had simply installed a small temporary sculpture, a work of contemporary art meant to reflect the seasons. Yet the HOA interpreted it as a violation of aesthetic regulations. The complaint, lodged anonymously, carried a sharp undertone. Conformity mattered more than creativity, and deviation, even from someone of Alex's influence, was not welcome. Maya Chun, ever vigilant, reviewed the documents and cautioned that the HOA was leveraging every tool available to intimidate residents. "They're testing boundaries," she explained. "This isn't about fines. It's about control." Alex, though unsettled, remained outwardly composed. They took long walks through the estate, observing how even the smallest imperfections, an untended flower bed or an uneven hedge, could become justification for scrutiny. The mountain, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage where every move was judged. The racial dynamics of the enclave grew more pronounced as Alex noticed the subtle differences in treatment compared to white neighbors. Invitations to community events arrived later or were phrased in conditional terms, conversations in social circles were measured and cautious, and commentary about state politics frequently carried an undertone questioning Alex's legitimacy in the community. The message was clear. Wealth and position did not erase social boundaries or unspoken hierarchies. Despite these pressures, Alex tried to maintain normalcy. Meetings with staff, private dinners, and evening strolls through the gardens continued as usual. Yet the sense of control was eroding. Each new notice from the HOA, each whispered observation, and each glance from a neighbor reinforced the fact that Mountain Ridge was governed as much by social codes and implicit biases as by written rules. One afternoon, Alex received a letter marked urgent. The HOA now claimed that the accumulated fines could result in property seizure. The language was legalistic, but the threat was unmistakable. Even as governor, Alex realized that the HOA had found ways to operate within technical legality while wielding disproportionate power. This realization was unsettling. The mountain, a place that had once offered solace and freedom, now felt constraining. The community's beauty, with its perfectly manicured lawns, polished stone facades, and curated gardens, had always masked an unspoken rigidity. Deviations, whether in garden design, sculpture placement, or simply a refusal to adhere to unwritten norms, were noted, scrutinized, and punished. Alex, whose mixed heritage added another layer of complexity to social perception, began to understand that the HOA's actions were not merely about aesthetics. They were about maintaining a social order that excluded and marginalized those who did not fit perfectly. By the end of the week, the peaceful life Alex had known atop the mountain was fractured. The letters, the whispers, the subtle judgments, all indicated a creeping force that could not be ignored. The HOA, backed by neighbors complicit in maintaining conformity, had become more than a minor bureaucratic annoyance. It was a tangible threat, a reflection of social and racial dynamics that wealth and political power alone could not fully counter. As the sun set behind the peaks, casting a golden glow over the mansion, Alex stood on the terrace, surveying the valley. The beauty remained breathtaking, but beneath it, the mountain whispered a warning. Control was an illusion, and even the most powerful were vulnerable to the subtle yet persistent forces of social hierarchy, prejudice, and institutional authority. The stage was set for confrontation, and Alex could feel the storm approaching. Confrontation and reckoning. By the time the sun rose over Mountain Ridge Estates, Alex Mercer's normally peaceful morning routine had become tense and calculated. The mansion that once felt like a sanctuary now carried an almost oppressive weight. Weeks of HOA letters, fines, and subtle neighborhood judgment had escalated into a tangible threat. A formal notice that demolition of the property could proceed if the accumulated fines remained unpaid. Alex walked the terrace, hands resting on the polished railing, observing the valley below. The morning light glinted off the stone facades of neighboring estates, each one pristine, each one an emblem of conformity. Birds chirped as if unaware of the looming conflict, but even nature could not dispel the unease that had settled over the mansion. Alex felt a mix of disbelief and quiet fury. The very community they had sought peace within was now poised to destroy their home. The social dynamics of Mountain Ridge Estates were impossible to ignore. Neighbors, some who had once nodded politely, now gave sidelong glances that conveyed judgment and disapproval. Caroline Voss, who had once commented on the sculpture placements with polite caution, now avoided Alex entirely, her daily walk passing silently by the gates without a word. Richard Hale, the HOA president, carried an air of authority so absolute it bordered on intimidation, confident that the rules he enforced were beyond challenge. The subtle racial and social hierarchies of the community, always present, had become pronounced, now weaponized to reinforce compliance. Alex convened an emergency meeting with their legal advisor, Maya Chun, and senior staff. Plans were drafted to contest the fines, issue formal challenges, and, if necessary, escalate the matter publicly. Despite holding the highest political office in the state, Alex realized that the HOA's power was uniquely insidious. It was bureaucratic, local, and couched in rules that could be interpreted in ways that left little room for negotiation. Wealth, influence, and status were not automatic shields. The realization was sobering but galvanized a sense of determination. As bulldozers and crews began to arrive at the property line, the tension escalated to an almost surreal level. The serenity of the mountain estate, the manicured gardens, the sunlit terraces, the expansive views, contrasted sharply with the threat of sudden destruction. It was as though the paradise Alex had curated over decades could be erased in hours, a reminder that appearances, however grand, were never sufficient protection against social or institutional control. The HOA representatives were precise, almost ceremonious in their enforcement. Each step of the process was documented, each violation noted, each complaint catalogued. Alex's mixed-race identity, coupled with their status as governor, seemed to make some neighbors even more invested in the spectacle. A test of boundaries, a demonstration of what was acceptable within Mountain Ridge. The racial and social undertones were unmistakable. The message was that power alone could not rewrite the invisible rules governing this community. Yet Alex was not without recourse. Leveraging their political influence and legal preparation, they halted the immediate demolition, calling in media attention and public scrutiny. Headlines captured the irony. A governor threatened by a homeowners association, a mansion at risk of destruction not because of negligence, but because of rigid, biased enforcement of obscure rules. Public opinion rallied in support, revealing the hypocrisy of Mountain Ridge estates and shining light on the subtle but pervasive dynamics of exclusion and control. Through the ordeal, Alex reflected on the fragile balance of peace and power. The mountain, once a haven, had exposed the limits of wealth and influence when faced with entrenched social hierarchies and racial bias. The aesthetic perfection of the estates, the polite smiles of neighbors, and the seemingly idyllic community were now revealed to be facades, maintained by vigilance, conformity, and unspoken prejudice. Even the most carefully curated life could not escape the subtle machinery of social enforcement. By evening, with the immediate threat averted, Alex stood once again on the terrace. The valley stretched endlessly below, bathed in the golden glow of sunset. Fountains sparkled, gardens bloomed, and the mansion stood intact, but the tranquility was forever altered. The mountain had become a symbol of both triumph and vulnerability, a reminder that peace was never guaranteed, and that even those with wealth, status, and political authority could be challenged by subtle but powerful forces of community, bias, and institutional authority. The confrontation left Alex with a new perspective. The HOA, the neighbors, the whispered judgments, and the fines were no longer small disturbances. They were a mirror of societal hierarchies, an intricate web of control woven into the very fabric of Mountain Ridge estates. The experience was a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the need to navigate power with awareness, humility, and vigilance. As night fell and the first stars appeared over the mountain peaks, Alex understood that the real victory was not merely saving the mansion. It was exposing the fragile nature of social and racial hierarchies, revealing the limits of privilege, and asserting the right to exist authentically within a world that constantly tests conformity. The estate, the community, and even the mountain itself would never look the same again, but Alex's resolve, like the peaks surrounding them, remained unshaken.